Hello, guys.
Тема моего доклада IDE как компонент.
Now, the subject of my presentation is ID as a component of web applications. Now, let's discuss why it could be important to you, actually.
Представлюсь. Меня зовут Даниил.
I'm Daniil. I am a developer from Positive Technologies. And in particular, I'm responsible for PT Application Inspector. Now, PT Application Inspector is a set of tools for static and dynamic code analysis, which is effectively a corporate solution, which is usually deployed on the client side in order to help them, the clients, people, do their security development. So what will this presentation look at? We've got some expertise in terms of implementing Web IDE in our application inspector. So I'm going to cover, why we actually came up with this, what kind of solutions or potential solutions we saw, what we did, what kind of barriers and obstacles we encountered, and what we have learned in the process.
Как мы пришли к задаче интеграции.
So the first one is how we decided to start integrating Web IDE in PT Application Inspector. Sometimes products with web interfaces will want to integrate a certain code element to support, some programming language syntax, or do code navigation, or some, IntelliSense issues, such as, effectively convenience of code development, or, in terms of launching or debugging. So these UX tasks taken individually are nothing special. However, integrating all of this into your product may require quite a lot of effort. So you will be wondering if you actually want to do it from scratch, if it can all be seen as a single objective, which is integration of a single web component, which is Web IDE.
Интегрируем нашу Web IDE-шку к себе. Что такое Web IDE?
So how do we do that? Now, Web IDE, for those who have forgotten it, is effectively a development environment inside your browser of choice, or maybe somebody else's browser of choice. Now, what you see in the screen is the interface of your development environment, while everything that's run in this development environment will be running on a server elsewhere that you connect to. So all the arduous operations such as debugging, IntelliSense, or code launching, all this is run on the server side. So you can simply connect to Web IDE, go to the beach with your laptop, or maybe even your phone, and code away right there.
Какие use cases использования Web IDE-шки я выделил?
So what are the use cases for Web IDE? Listed here are some of the most popular ones, but there certainly will be others. So it could be good for education and online courses. Now, you should be able to find lots and lots of cases online. Indeed, education is all the rage now. Now, the second case is a development of prototypes and design. I guess many of you must have used various sandboxes that are based on Web IDEs. Now, the third case is data analysis and representation.
Различных системах контролях версий, это будь то GitHub, GitLab.
It should also include version control. Think GitHub, for example, and GitLab. So GitHub and GitLab have recently done their integrations of Web IDEs, which means that you can easily use, your version control system now as you are using them. You can do your commits, for example, this way. Now, the fourth case is saving your resources. Now, it's pretty much an infrastructural statement here. You can use Web IDE as intended, so to speak. So rather than giving people laptops so that they work, like business users, you can simply give them access to Web IDE.
нужна локальная тачка, чтобы, допустим...
Well, there will be cases where you will need like a local machine if you need to develop, say, some applications, maybe an Android application or a desktop application. So in some cases, this will be the suboptimal idea, but in so many cases, you can in fact replace hardware with Web IDE. What's also important here is that our users, or say a server running Web IDE, like if they get disconnected from the power source, well, obviously your work will have to wait until connection is restored. Another case for Web IDE usage is like this. This is actually something that we presented at Positive Hack Days Festival. Some of you must have been involved. Now, that was Application Inspector Fixathon contest, where we gave people Web IDE with some vulnerable applications, and people also got our Application Inspector, which is a free-to-use analyzer, and they were actually expected to identify and patch vulnerabilities, and depending on the number of vulnerabilities they were able to patch, they would get prizes. The number of prizes is limited, but the contest is still running. So you can easily find this booth where I'm showing in the map. So it's in Cyber Hub Center. However, we will not be talking about Fixathon right now. Instead, we'll tell you how it all started. Let me remind you that all this is effectively a platform for supporting secure team development. Now, we all know that secure development should be covered by, I guess, SSDLC, and we have our developers, typing away, committing their changes, developing new code, while our application inspector will be scanning this code and making scan reports. Now, the problem here is that somebody will need to look at these scan reports. This somebody is apparently our security expert. Somebody who will say, well, this is a false positive or a true positive, what's to fix here and what's to ignore. So, we have an interface here for that, but the problem is that very often, in order to understand how many fixes we need to make, we need to see the overall code context. That's why security professionals will look at the interface. There will be some representation of the data flow, but in order for them to see if a particular vulnerability can be triggered or not, we will need to fire the local IDE, go to a particular branch, and only then we should be able to see that, okay, this is a false positive, but this needs to be addressed. So it makes me think of those, minor pull requests that you got to go through on a Friday and you don't have a local IDE to help you.
So
we understand what the problem is. We need to get rid of this extra step of reviewing local project and mapping scan results to local IDE. What do? Well, naturally, we can replace the local IDE so that IDE is automatically launched in browser and results of the scan can be shown there directly. Sounds like a great idea. How can we do that? So rather than, integrating a new component and, that would require learning about this component, how about we develop everything from scratch? Again, you can do that. It might actually work in some contexts, although much here will really depend on the availability of resources in your company. Naturally, it's much easier to do the same through Web IDE. So let's integrate Web IDE. What are the options available for Web IDE integration? Now, I'm showing them here as three groups. IDEs that are coming from JetBrains, that is Fleet primarily. Now, there are some others that are sort of similar. Now there is also Microsoft family, primarily represented by Visual Studio Code, and some other IDEs in Group 3. Why such a division? Well, JetBrains and Microsoft are some well-known IDEs that are known for various purposes, and the range of needs they cover is quite extensive. Well, the other IDEs would include some no-name IDEs and language-specific IDEs, such as Collab, MATLAB, which are good in their own way, but not exactly what we need here. So, we want to integrate a component into our product, and we simply cannot play with JetBrains because of license constraints. Now, Visual Studio Code appears to be the only option. In fact, we had our own free plugin for static analysis. It's called Application Inspection. You can easily download it. So it was only natural for us to choose Visual Studio Code as it supports our plugin. Now, back then, Visual Studio Code server, VS Code server patch was not released yet. That's why we chose a particular fork. But, you know, right now, the official VS Code server is available, so I recommend you use it. Okay, what's a code server? It's an open source project which relies on our VS Code as a fork, as a component. It's effectively a kind of a wrapper on Node.js above the VS Code server, and it has some features that the code server doesn't have by default. Here I am referring, for example, to rate limiter, proxy support, authentication and authorization, and so on. Okay, you've selected your code server. What happens next? How do you integrate? Let me repeat again that we are using a microservices platform here, which is being deployed on a user machine. So these are effectively Docker images. So the code server we are going to use will be just a single one made of Docker images. So we have three components here: the VS Code client, the VS Code server, and as a standalone component, we have a set of plugins, because it's a large code class which can be reused. So this way, we will be using a component which has some other components under the hood. So it's effectively a low-code solution. So our VS Code client sends a call from the browser, goes through the gateway to our server, which will generate some child processes where, you know, the whole environment for the client is run. So among this child process, some will be responsible for individual plugins, and our plugin will be talking to all the other services of the application inspector, so that, you know, the scan is done, for example, and the scan results are represented, and yeah, that's it. So what you see here is a diagram showing how users are going to use VS Code server. So a request is sent from the browser. The backend server gets it. I mean, Web IDE backend gets it. Now, what we're showing here is that we've redone authorization. So, for example, we're using JSON Web Tokens in our projects to that end. So we're looking at the JSON Web Token, and we also need to validate that the particular user has access to specific scan results. To do that, we need to send a request to the backend, get the validation. Now, if everything is fine, the user gets access, like if the token is not stale. Then we tell them, perfect, you got a client. You know, VS Code client. So we've got the source code here. So Web IDE, when it started, when it's launched, we'll know exactly which project to fire up. This is really easy and convenient. Now we have VS Code client now in the browser. It looks like a large HTML file, which has lots and lots of scripts, JavaScript scripts in it, which will then upload all the content and will establish a WebSocket connection using which our client is going to talk to the server. Following that, once we've initialized the client, we'll need to invoke the plugin so that it gets the scanning results and shows them in the screen. Now let's talk about the VS Code client. Since it's a full-fledged fork, we can easily change anything we see in the screen. So we can do any view, for example.
Все компоненты, которые видно на экране, модифицируются.
All the components you can see in the screen are modifiable, which is good. Like you can edit, you can delete.
Так как идет работа в браузере,
since all this is done in the browser, we're also able to use all the tools available in the front end, such as cookies, sessions, local storage.
Используем local storage для того, чтобы плагин мог.
For example, we will be using local storage for the plugin to get access to JSON token. So this way, we can control the theme, so to speak, of the project. We can also get subscribed to changes and get synced. So, for example, you can change the theme in the application inspector, and then the same theme will be changed in Web IDE. Now, the third item here deals with the pre-installation of plugins. Later on, I'll tell you which plugins are available out there, and that takes care of a section of the code that you don't need to write on your own. You can rather reuse it. Now, VS Code plugins. Now, the client has been initialized on the browser. Now, we also need to initialize the application inspector plugin so that it will show the results of the analysis using the publicly accessible source code. So that requires registering a command on the client side, and as a callback, it will get the arguments that we need. What are the other plugins available? In fact, there are many. VS Code has a major, like an extensive market of extensions and plugins. I guess many of you guys know the extension market. But just to be on the safe side, let me say that, there are numerous viewers available so that you can see, you can inspect numerous files. There are also various language service protocol plugins. For example, the plugin we used in order to do project navigation belong to that family. And they effectively enable you to work with this or that programming language, because application inspector can work with so many different programming languages, and Web IDE should also support them. Cosmetic, we're not really interested in that right now, although they are available. There are also plugins for integration with various services, such as version control systems and tracking systems and Jira and so on. Interestingly enough, you can edit such integration plugins, some proprietary plugins, such as our static analysis plugin, and others.
Вот как раз я много говорил про наши плагины статического анализа.
I've been talking a lot about our statistical analysis plugins. If you're interested, we've got one for VS Code, another one for JetBrains IDE. They are free to use. You don't need a license. They list all the languages they can support for scanning purposes, so please make use of them. The only exception is that you cannot use them for teamwork. It's like a physical limitation. Like, we cannot allow you to share results. But for individual purposes, by all means, make use of this free and convenient tool. Actually, one of such plugins was used at our booth called Application Inspector Fixathon. So we have our Web IDE. We have changed the three main components to get what we wanted. And now the users no longer need to go into the local IDE. Instead, they can fire up IDE in their browsers and see scanning results. So let's see how it works. A demonstration now.
Должна быть видеозапись.
The clip should be playing now, as you must have gathered.
небольшая техническая заминка. Вот.
I'm sorry for this technical hiccup. So this is the application inspector.
Мы открыли какой-то проект.
Now, we have started some project here. And we see numerous vulns here. We also see an interface which shows them all. So we can show them, we can filter them, or we can inspect and filter them. There are numerous other actions available. And all this is nice, but apparently this won't be enough for full-fledged analysis. Particularly if we're interested in seeing what are the exploitation opportunities available. So we can go here and see where this vuln is, which file it sits in. We can also take a look at the data flow diagrams. Now, shown here are various entry points and other elements of the data flow. We can even open the file itself. Now, the interface here is similar to what you find in GitHub. However, all you can do is just use Ctrl-F to look for the stuff that you need. You cannot really do proper in-file navigation. You cannot really see where a particular variable is pointing, and so on. So, a security professional is expected to look at it all and make their conclusion. For instance, they will decide, okay, this is an important vulnerability, we need to fix it. There could be numerous vulns like this, which means that there could be lots of projects like this. And all this requires is a local IDE. However, we've been able to address this issue like this. Now, we have a button called Open in Web IDE. You press it, it's done. So source code is fired up, rates are checked, and then you see the results of the scan. Here, you're able to jump around the code. You can see the views here. You can see, say, the data flow diagrams. You can also see an example of the exploit generated by application inspector, and also additional conditions for the exploitation to happen. It also shows the scan history. So you can easily go from one vulnerability to another, or you can navigate using the data flow diagram. So this is a full-blown IDE, which means you can easily stop at any string, for example, and do this. If you want to see how a particular function is implemented, and you can see where it's used, you can check the references, and this is exactly what we wanted to have. What else can you find in the IDE? In the same way, you can set a status for the vulns, like is it a false positive or does it need to be fixed? So a security professional can now work in a single window, so to speak, because he's got all the context here. You can also use diverse filters. So, for example, if you discard a particular vulnerability, you can set up a filter for it, so it's no longer shown, but then you can switch the filter off and it's shown again. And, once you approve it, it's synchronized with the web. What else? We also have this nifty button called Show Vuln Description. So in this extra window, you can see the description of the CV, you can see the links. It's just another way of getting information. Now, as regards plugin reuse rather, Application Inspector can generate an exploit description, I guess. So using this external plugin called REST request or something like this, you can send requests from IDE, and it's just a walk in the park. All you gotta do is install the plugin. See, we've changed the theme, we've installed some filters, and then through local storage or request query parameters, so it's done like this. Now we go for a particular place we're interested, we open it, and voila, our ID shows it in the right place, at the execution stage, so to speak. very, very convenient. Now, it naturally improves your performance by leaps and bounds.
Что мы из этого вынесли, на что нас
Lessons learned.
Про наш опыт. Первый пункт, про который хотелось бы рассказать, это ограничение ресурсов. Мы не должны забывать, что...
The first one is about resource constraints. Now, we have integrated a component, like a full-blown IDE, isn't it?
У нас есть примерные цифры,
So, the rough estimates are like this. 150 megabytes is required per empty instance of Web IDE, which is not really nothing, right? And it's an empty instance.
Дальше мы добавляем LSP-плагин.
So if you add the LSP plugin and a small project, and it's more like 400 megabytes. Now, what this means is that a system like this will require some resources, depending on the number of users. So 400 megabytes is still like an empty project. Now, we also need to take into account which programming language it is. Like if it's a Java LSP plugin or JavaScript LSP plugin, the work required will differ. So the amount of memory required naturally will correlate with the size of the project. That's why we actually had to limit in terms of memory usage some LSP plugins. For example, we would limit that for Java plugin. We would use command line arguments. We would limit the Java heap size, and that helped. Now, the plugin became a bit dumber because of that, but that was a necessary evil. Now, the second conclusion stemming from that is that if we have run out of memory and if we cannot have access to swap, because swap sometimes needs to be switched off, we can easily reboot the container. Now, VS Code is actually pretty good at managing memory, reallocating it between instances. But if we switch swap off, naturally, many sessions that we run can actually be rebooted. And the second conclusion, related to the first one, is about scaling. Now, frankly speaking, we did not have such an objective because we are running a single platform on in fact, on a single machine. But if you scale it somewhere in the cloud, you would naturally want to scale your IDE. So naturally, you will need to do a load balancer and a server pool here. What are the obstacles here? What are the speed bumps? Now, at times, you will need to link a particular user to a particular server. For example, in GitHub, we would link a particular Web IDE session to a particular user. Sometimes you have to do that. Secondly, data synchronization. If different Web IDE instances will change the same piece of resource, we need to synchronize it somehow. And the last item I want to cover here is security. After all, it's a information security conference. But before I do that, I should first say a few words about the context. Like, we first need to determine who the additional users are, and only after that, we can take care of the constraints. So, it was important for us to make sure that users, would not be able to, say, accidentally destroy their containers or otherwise shoot themselves in the feet. So at Fixathon, there have been numerous challenges for the participants, as they had to secure the whole infrastructure. So far, nobody seems to have broken the infrastructure, but then the conference isn't over yet. You can still give it a try. So security-wise, we wanted to limit comment execution from the terminal. Now, if we want the container to exist, it needs to be addressed. How do we do that? Well, A, we want to make sure that terminal cannot be used on web, but then, Web IDE can be hacked or edited. Ideally, we want to block the terminal channel on the backend. Now, the second item here is a rootless container. If we don't want users to escape the container, we shouldn't really give them rights that would enable them to do that. Even if they use some 0-day in VS Code, they should not be able to screw the container up. Next item is a limitation of changes in shared resources. So here, naturally, I'm talking about the source code primarily. We certainly don't want regular users to be able to edit it. Code launch. Again, we need to consider what our users should be allowed to launch and what not. Because, there is some room for maneuver, particularly if you're a hacker. Finally, there are remote access plugins, which can enable some, shall I say, unauthorized access? Or malicious access. So what have we got? We have been able to integrate everything we wanted to integrate with our Web IDE. It required fewer resources than we would have spent had we been doing it manually. Now we have a powerful component which can later be used for numerous purposes, such as integration of version control systems or integration of various trackers. And all in all, it's a very nifty thing to have. Users love it, and our developers love it, because our Web IDE is helping the team develop more products, which is great news. I've told you about the needs addressed by Web IDE. I hope you found this presentation interesting or maybe even useful. And maybe you will consider Web IDE integration one day, because it's not that difficult and it will look great and be great for the users. Thank you very much. You can assess my presentation. I hope you liked it.
Спасибо, Даниил. Сейчас мы зачитаем.
Yes, thank you very much, Daniil. Let me read out the questions we have already received.
Один из аспектов подхода к
One of the aspects
является экономия ресурсов.
of server ID usage is a resource optimization.
Будет ли такая
And
возможность?
still, we would love to see some initial unit tests here. Will your ID be able to do that? Or can we get results of the test with a Git hook so that we can continue working on the project in the same tab?
Интересный вопрос.
That's an interesting question.
Сейчас у нас не реализована
Right now,
Git интеграция, да, и
we do not have Git integration yet. And it's difficult for us to change the source code because the Web IDE so far has been designed to show the scan results. But in the future, yes, that's a possibility for sure. Much will really depend on where we take this project and how many resources are available. To what extent is your solution hooked to a particular version of VS Code server? Are you going to switch to the official release or not? It's a good one. We have actually changed a lot in our code server. At the same time, we try to make sure that those changes were, should I say, gentle, so that as code server gets updated, we would be able to merge everything nicely. Which means that we can currently update to the current state of code server. And yes, I think we should be able to kind of merge it with the official release, but at the moment it doesn't seem to be required. Can Web IDE be configured for a specific user so that those individual settings don't get lost between sessions? Can they be sort of linked to a particular user account? Well, that's a nice
У
question.
нас сейчас из кастомизации код-сервера, которые мы предоставляем,
Now, the code server customization we're offering right now
иконочки,
provides for customized icons,
правда, одну из
customized
в процессе
themes.
разработки. Эти
That's
настройки
still
у
in the
нас
pipeline, apparently.
в local storage.
Now, these settings will be saved in local storage, which means that, yes, they will persist for individual users.
Многие IDE позволяют пользователю
Many
запускать свои
IDEs
процессы.
enable
Например,
users
через
to launch
терминал.
their own processes through the terminal, for example. Where will they be launched? On the server or the client machine? And whether it's secure. Now, they will be launched on the server side.
Надо определить, что на нас
Security-wise,
безопасно, и исходя
well,
из этого
you gotta first define what's secure and what's not for you, and then depending on that, limit the functions available to the IDE.
Плагин в IDE,
Can
который уже
your
интегрирован
plugin be integrated into IDE, which is already integrated into some other product?
который использовался у нас в Web IDE,
Now, the plugin we used for Web IDE is a free-to-use plugin. The QR code was in my slides. You can download it
нужно будет только скачать
and
анализатор.
use it free of charge. All you gotta do is download the
на
analyzer.
демонстрации, что можно подтверждать
I
уязвимость
saw in the
из
demo
стороннего
that
окна.
you
А не
can
думали
confirm
сделать
vulnerabilities
это
from
возможным
a
из
separate window.
фиксов?
How about doing it from quick fixes?
Это возможно.
That's a good question indeed. Indeed, there is an opportunity for that. It just wasn't shown in the demo. But yes, you can do that for sure.
Вопросы закончились. Какой
Thank you very
вопрос
much.
понравился
That puts the lid on the questions. Which of these questions did you like the most?
Понравился про то, как мы поддерживаем код, если
I think it was about the way we support the code. If the author is here, please
пультовой? Все, большое спасибо.
come over to the engineers so that we can give you your prize. Thank you so much. That's the end of this presentation.